Chapters 8 and 9 of The Red Battle Flyer by Captain Manfred von Richthofen. Translated by T. L. S. Barker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 8. My First English Victim. 17th September, 1915. We were all at the butts trying our machine guns. On the previous day we had received our new aeroplanes, and the next morning Boelcke was to fly with us. We were all beginners. None of us had a success so far. Consequently, everything that Boelcke told us was to us gospel truth. Every day during the last few days he had, as he said, shot 1 or 2 Englishmen for breakfast. The next morning, the 17th of September, was a gloriously fine day. It was therefore only to be expected that the English would be very active. Before we started, Boelcke repeated to us his instructions, and for the first time we flew as a squadron, commanded by the great man whom we followed blindly. We had just arrived at the front when we recognized a hostile flying squadron that was proceeding in the direction of Cambrai. Boelcke was of course the first to see it, for he saw a great deal more than ordinary mortals. Soon we understood the position, and every one of us strove to follow Boelcke closely. It was clear to all of us that we should pass our first examination under the eyes of our beloved leader. Slowly we approached the hostile squadron. It could not escape us. We had intercepted it, for we were between the front and our opponents. If they wished to go back, they had to pass us. We counted the hostile machines. They were 7 in number. We were only 5. All the Englishmen flew large bomb-carrying 2-seaters. In a few seconds the dance would begin. Boelcke had come very near the first English machine, but he did not yet shoot. I followed. Close to me were my comrades. The Englishman nearest to me was traveling in a large boat painted with dark colors. I did not reflect very long, but took my aim and shot. He also fired, and so did I, and both of us missed our aim. A struggle began, and the great point for me was to get to the rear of the fellow, because I could only shoot forward with my gun. He was differently placed, for his machine gun was movable. It could fire in all directions. Apparently he was no beginner, for he knew exactly that his last hour had arrived at the moment when I got at the back of him. At that time I had not yet the conviction he must fall, which I have now on such occasions. But on the contrary, I was curious to see whether he would fall. There is a great difference between the two feelings. When one has shot down one's first, second or third opponent, then one begins to find out how the trick is done. My Englishman twisted and turned, going criss-cross. I did not think for a moment that the hostile squadron contained other Englishmen who might conceivably come to the aid of their comrade. I was animated by a single thought. The man in front of me must come down, whatever happens. At last a favorable moment arrived. My opponent had apparently lost sight of me. Instead of twisting and turning, he flew straight along. In a fraction of a second I was at his back with my excellent machine. I gave him a short series of shots with my machine gun. I had gone so close that I was afraid I might dash into the Englishman. Suddenly I nearly yelled with joy, for the propeller of the enemy machine had stopped turning. I had shot his engine to pieces. The enemy was compelled to land, for it was impossible for him to reach his own lines. The English machine was curiously swinging to and fro. Probably something had happened to the pilot. The observer was no longer visible. His machine gun was apparently deserted. Obviously I had hit the observer, and he had fallen from his seat. The Englishman landed close to the flying ground of one of our squadrons. I was so excited that I landed also, and my eagerness was so great that I nearly smashed up my machine. The English flying machine and my own stood close together. I rushed to the English machine and saw that a lot of soldiers were running towards my enemy. When I arrived, I discovered that my assumption had been correct. I had shot the engine to pieces, and both the pilot and observer were severely wounded. The observer died at once, and the pilot while being transported to the nearest dressing station. I honored the fallen enemy by placing a stone on his beautiful grave. When I came home, Boelke and my other comrades were already at breakfast. They were surprised that I had not turned up. I reported proudly that I had shot down an Englishman. All were full of joy, for I was not the only victor. As usual, Boelke had shot down an opponent for breakfast, and every one of the other men also had downed an enemy for the first time. I would mention that, since that time, no English squadron ventured as far as Cambrai as long as Boelke's squadron was there. The Battle of the Somme. During my whole life, I have not found a happier hunting ground than in the course of the Somme battle. In the morning, as soon as I had got up, the first Englishman arrived, and the last did not disappear until long after sunset. Boelke once said that this was the El Dorado of the flying men. There was a time when, within 2 months, Boelke's bag of machines increased from 20 to 40. We beginners had not at that time the experience of our master, and we were quite satisfied when we did not get a hiding. It was an exciting period. Every time we went up, we had a fight. Frequently we fought really big battles in the air. There were sometimes from 40 to 60 English machines, but unfortunately the Germans were often in the minority. With them, quality was more important than quantity. Still, the Englishman is a smart fellow. That we must allow. Sometimes the English came down to a very low altitude and visited Boelke in his quarters, upon which they threw their bombs. They absolutely challenged us to battle and never refused fighting. We had a delightful time with our chasing squadron. The spirit of our leader animated all his pupils. We trusted him blindly. There was no possibility that one of us would be left behind. Such a thought was incomprehensible to us. Animated by that spirit, we gaily diminished the number of our enemies. On the day when Boelke fell, the squadron had brought down 40 opponents. By now the number has been increased by more than 100. Boelke's spirit lives still among his capable successors. Boelke's death, 28 October 1916. One day we were flying, once more guided by Boelke, against the enemy. We always had a wonderful feeling of security when he was with us. After all, he was the one and only. The weather was very gusty and there were many clouds. There were no aeroplanes about, except fighting ones. From a long distance we saw 2 impertinent Englishmen in the air, who actually seemed to enjoy the terrible weather. We were 6, and they were 2. If they had been 20, and if Boelke had given us the signal to attack, we should not have been at all surprised. The struggle began in the usual way. Boelke tackled the one and I the other. I had to let go because one of the German machines got in my way. I looked around and noticed Boelke settling his victim about 200 yards away from me. It was the usual thing. Boelke would shoot down his enemy and I had to look on. Close to Boelke flew a good friend of his. It was an interesting struggle. Both men were shooting. It was probable that the Englishman would fall at any moment. Suddenly I noticed an unnatural movement of the 2 German flying machines. Immediately I thought, collision. I had not yet seen a collision in the air. I had imagined that it would look quite different. In reality, what happened was not a collision. The 2 machines merely touched one another. However, if 2 machines go at the tremendous pace of flying machines, the slightest contact has the effect of a violent concussion. Boelke drew away from his victim and descended in large curves. He did not seem to be falling, but when I saw him descending below me, I noticed that part of his planes had broken off. I could not see what happened afterwards, but in the clouds he lost an entire plane. Now his machine was no longer steerable. It fell accompanied all the time by Boelke's faithful friend. When we reached home we found the report, "Boelke is dead," had already arrived. We could scarcely realize it. The greatest pain was, of course, felt by the man who had the misfortune to be involved in the accident. It is a strange thing that everybody who met Boelke imagined that he alone was his true friend. I have made the acquaintance of about 40 men, each of whom imagined that he alone was Boelke's intimate. Each imagined that he had the monopoly of Boelke's affections. Men whose names were unknown to Boelke believed that he was particularly fond of them. This is a curious phenomenon which I have never noticed in anyone else. Boelcke had not a personal enemy. He was equally polite to everybody, making no differences. The only one who was perhaps more intimate with him than the others was the very man who had the misfortune to be in the accident which caused his death. Nothing happens without God's will. That is the only consolation which any of us can put to our souls during this war. My eighth victim. In Boelcke's time, 8 was quite a respectable number. Those who hear nowadays of the colossal bags made by certain aviators must feel convinced that it has become easier to shoot down a machine. I can assure those who hold that opinion that the flying business is becoming more difficult from month to month and even from week to week. Of course, with the increasing number of aeroplanes, one gains increased opportunities for shooting down one's enemies, but at the same time, the possibility of being shot down oneself increases. The armament of our enemies is steadily improving and their number is increasing. When Immelmann shot down his first victim, he had the good fortune to find an opponent who carried not even a machine gun. Such little innocence one finds nowadays only at the training ground for beginners. On the 9th of November 1916, I flew towards the enemy with my little comrade Immelmann, who then was 18 years old. We were both in Boelcke's squadron of chasing aeroplanes. We had previously met one another and had got on very well. Comradeship is a most important thing. We went to work. I had already bagged 7 enemies and Immelmann 5. At that time, this was quite a lot. Soon after our arrival at the front, we saw a squadron of bombing aeroplanes. They were coming along with impertinent assurance. They arrived in enormous numbers as was usual during the Somme battle. I think there were about 40 or 50 machines approaching. I cannot give the exact answer. They had selected an object for their bombs not far from our aerodrome. I reached them when they had almost attained their objective. I approached the last machine. My first few shots incapacitated the hostile machine gunner. Possibly they had tickled the pilot too. At any rate, he resolved to land with his bombs. I fired a few more shots to accelerate his progress downwards. He fell close to our flying ground at Le Ginocourt. While I was fighting my opponent, Immelmann had tackled another Englishman and had brought him down in the same locality. Both of us flew quickly home in order to have a look at the machines we had downed. We jumped into a motor car, drove in the direction where our victims lay, and had to run along a distance through the fields. It was very hot, therefore I unbuttoned all my garments, even the collar and the shirt. I took off my jacket, left my cap in the car, but took with me a big stick. My boots were miry up to the knees. I looked like a tramp. I arrived in the vicinity of my victim. In the meantime, a lot of people had of course gathered around. At one spot there was a group of officers. I approached them, greeted them, and asked the first one whom I met whether he could tell me anything about the aspect of the aerial battle. It is always interesting to find out how a fight in the air looks to the people down below. I was told that the English machine had thrown bombs and that the aeroplane that had come down was still carrying its bombs. The officer who gave me this information took my arm, went with me to the other officers, asked my name, and introduced me to them. I did not like it, for my attire was rather disarranged. On the other hand, all the officers looked as spick and span as on parade. I was introduced to a personage who impressed me rather strangely. I noticed a general's trousers, an order at the neck, an unusually youthful face and undefinable epaulets. In short, the personage seemed extraordinary to me. During our conversation I buttoned my trousers and collar and adopted a somewhat military attitude. I had no idea who the officer was. I took my leave and went home again. In the evening the telephone rang and I was told that the undefinable somebody with whom I had been talking had been His Royal Highness, the Grand Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. I was ordered to go to him. It was known that the English had intended to throw bombs on his headquarters. Apparently, I had helped to keep the aggressors away from him. Therefore, I was given the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha medal for bravery. I always enjoy this adventure when I look at the medal. Major Hawker. I was extremely proud when, one fine day, I was informed that the airman whom I had brought down on the 23rd of November, 1916, was the English Immelmann. In view of the character of our fight, it was clear to me that I had been tackling a flying champion. One day I was blithely flying to give chase when I noticed 3 Englishmen who also had apparently gone hunting. I noticed that they were ogling me, and as I felt much inclination to have a fight, I did not want to disappoint them. I was flying at a lower altitude. Consequently, I had to wait until one of my English friends tried to drop on me. After a short while on, the 3 came sailing along and attempted to tackle me in the rear. After firing 5 shots, he had to stop, for I had swerved in a sharp curve. The Englishman tried to catch me up in the rear while I tried to get behind him. So we circled round and round like madmen after one another at an altitude of about 10,000 feet. First we circled 20 times to the left, and then 30 times to the right, each tried to get behind and above the other. Soon I discovered I was not meeting a beginner. He had not the slightest intention of breaking off the fight. He was traveling in a machine which turned beautifully. However, my own was better at rising than his, and I succeeded at last in getting above and beyond my English waltzing partner. When we had got down to about 6,000 feet without having achieved anything in particular, my opponent ought to have discovered that it was time for him to take his leave. The wind was favorable to me, for it drove us more and more towards the German position. At last we were above Bapaume, about half a mile behind the German front. The impertinent fellow was full of cheek, and when we had got down to about 3,000 feet, he merrily waved to me as if he would say, "Well, how do you do?" The circles which we made around one another were so narrow that their diameter was probably no more than 250 or 300 feet. I had time to take a good look at my opponent. I looked down into his carriage and could see every movement of his head. If he had not had his cap on, I would have noticed what kind of a face he was making. My Englishman was a good sportsman, but by and by the thing became a little too hot for him. He had to decide whether he would land on German ground or whether he would fly back to the English lines. Of course, he tried the latter, after having endeavored in vain to escape me by loopings and such like tricks. At that time his first bullets were flying around me, for hitherto neither of us had been able to do any shooting. When he had come down to about 300 feet, he tried to escape by flying in a zigzag course, during which, as is well known, it is difficult for an observer to shoot. That was my most favorable moment. I followed him at an altitude of from 250 feet to 150 feet, firing all the time. The Englishman could not help falling, but the jamming of my gun nearly robbed me of my success. My opponent fell, shot through the head, 150 feet behind our line. His machine gun was dug out of the ground, and it ornaments the entrance of my dwelling. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. I get the ordre pour le mourir. I had brought down my 16th victim, and I had come to the head of the list of all the flying chasers. I had obtained the aim which I had set myself. In the previous year, my friend Linker, with whom I was training, had asked me, "What is your object? What will you obtain by flying?" I replied jokingly, "I would like to be the first of the chasers. That must be very fine." That I should succeed in this, I did not believe myself. Other people also did not expect my success. Boelcke is supposed to have said, not to me personally, I have only heard the report, when asked, "Which of the fellows is likely to become a good chaser?" That is the man, pointing his finger in my direction. Boelcke and Immelmann were given the ordre pour le mourir when they had brought down their 8th aeroplane. I had downed twice that number. The question was, what would happen to me? I was very curious. It was rumored that I was to be given command of a chasing squadron. One day a telegram arrived which stated, "Lieutenant von Richthofen is appointed commander of the 11th Chasing Squadron." I must say I was annoyed. I had learnt to work so well with my comrades of Boelcke's squadron, and now I had to begin all over again, working hand in hand with different people. It was a beastly nuisance. Besides, I should have preferred the ordre pour le mourir. 2 days later, when we were sitting sociably together, we men of Boelcke's squadron, celebrating my departure, a telegram from headquarters arrived. It stated that His Majesty had graciously condescended to give me the Ordre pour le Mérite. Of course, my joy was tremendous. I had never imagined that it would be so delightful to command a chasing squadron. Even in my dreams I had not imagined that there would ever be a Richthofen squadron of aeroplanes. Les Petits Rogers. It occurred to me to have my packing case painted all over in staring red. The result was that everyone got to know my red bird. My opponents also seemed to have heard of the color transformation. During a fight on quite a different section of the front, I had the good fortune to shoot into a Vickers two-seater, which peacefully photographed the German artillery position. My friend the photographer had not the time to defend himself. He had to make haste to get down upon firm ground, for his machine began to give suspicious indications of fire. When we airmen notice that phenomenon in an enemy plane, we say, "He stinks." As it turned out, it was really so. When the machine was coming to earth, it burst into flames. I felt some human pity for my opponent and had resolved not to cause him to fall down, but merely to compel him to land. I did so particularly because I had the impression that my opponent was wounded, for he did not fire a single shot. When I had got down to an altitude of about 1,500 feet, engine trouble compelled me to land without making any curves. The result was very comical. My enemy, with his burning machine, landed smoothly, while I, his victor, came down next to him in the barbed wire of our trenches, and my machine overturned. The two Englishmen, who were not a little surprised at my collapse, greeted me like sportsmen. As mentioned before, they had not fired a shot, and they could not understand why I had landed so clumsily. They were the first two Englishmen whom I had brought down alive. Consequently, it gave me particular pleasure to talk to them. I asked them whether they had previously seen my machine in the air, and one of them replied, "Oh yes, I know your machine very well. We call it Les Petits Rogers." English and French Flying, February 1917. I was trying to compete with Boelcke's squadron. Every evening we compared our bags. However, Boelcke's pupils are smart rascals. I cannot get ahead of them. The utmost one can do is to draw level with them. The Boelcke section has an advantage over my squadron of 100 aeroplanes downed. I must allow them to retain it. Everything depends on whether we have for opponents those French tricksters or those daring rascals, the English. I prefer the English. Frequently their daring can only be described as stupidity. In their eyes it may be pluck and daring. The great thing in air fighting is that the decisive factor does not lie in trick flying, but solely in the personal ability and energy of the aviator. A flying man may be able to loop and do all the stunts imaginable, and yet he may not succeed in shooting down a single enemy. In my opinion, the aggressive spirit is everything, and that spirit is very strong in us Germans. Hence we shall always retain the domination of the air. The French have a different character. They like to put traps and to attack their opponents unawares. That cannot easily be done in the air. Only a beginner can be caught, and one cannot set traps because an aeroplane cannot hide itself. The invisible aeroplane has not yet been discovered. Sometimes, however, the Gallic blood asserts itself. The Frenchman will then attack. But the French attacking spirit is like bottled lemonade. It lacks tenacity. The Englishmen, on the other hand, one notices that they are of Germanic blood. Sportsmen easily take to flying, and Englishmen see in flying nothing but a sport. They take a perfect delight in looping the loop, flying on their back, and indulging in other stunts for the benefit of our soldiers in the trenches. All these tricks may impress people who attend a sports meeting, but the public at the battlefield is not as appreciative of these things. It demands higher qualifications than trick flying. Therefore, the blood of English pilots will have to flow in streams. I am shot down, middle of March, 1917. I have had an experience which might perhaps be described as being shot down. At the same time, I call shot down only when one falls down. Today I got into trouble, but I escaped with a whole skin. I was flying with the squadron and noticed an opponent who was also flying in a squadron. It happened above the German artillery position in the neighborhood of Lens. I had to fly quite a distance to get there. It tickles one's nerves to fly towards the enemy, especially when one can see him from a long distance and when several minutes must elapse before one can start fighting. I imagine that at such a moment my face turns a little pale, but unfortunately I have never had a mirror with me. I like that feeling, for it is a wonderful nerve stimulant. One observes the enemy from afar. One has recognized that his squadron is really an enemy formation. One counts the number of the hostile machines and considers whether the conditions are favorable or unfavorable. A factor of enormous importance is whether the wind forces me away from or towards our front. For instance, I once shot down an Englishman. I fired the fatal shot above the English position. However, the wind was so strong that his machine came down close to the German captive balloons. We Germans had 5 machines. Our opponents were 3 times as numerous. The English flew about like midges. It is not easy to disperse a swarm of machines which fly together in good order. It is impossible for a single machine to do it. It is extremely difficult for several aeroplanes, particularly if the difference in number is as great as it was in this case. However, one feels such a superiority over the enemy that one does not doubt of success for a moment. The aggressive spirit, the offensive, is the chief thing everywhere in war, and the air is no exception. However, the enemy had the same idea. I noticed that at once. As soon as they observed us, they turned round and attacked us. Now we 5 had to look sharp. If one of them should fall, there might be a lot of trouble for all of us. We went close together and allowed the foreign gentleman to approach us. I watched whether one of the fellows would hurriedly take leave of his colleagues. There, one of them is stupid enough to depart alone. I can reach him, and I say to myself, that man is lost. Shouting aloud, I am after him. I have come up to him, or at least am getting very near to him. He starts shooting prematurely, which shows that he is nervous. So I say to myself, go on shooting. You won't hit me. He shot with a kind of ammunition which ignites, so I could see his shots passing me. I felt as if I were sitting in front of a gigantic watering pot. The sensation was not pleasant. Still, the English usually shoot with their beastly stuff, and so we must try and get accustomed to it. One can get accustomed to anything. At the moment, I think, I laughed aloud. But soon I got a lesson. When I had approached the Englishman quite closely, when I had come to a distance of about 300 feet, I got ready for firing, aimed, and gave a few trial shots. The machine guns were in order. The decision would be there before long. In my mind's eye, I saw my enemy dropping. My former excitement was gone. In such a position, one thinks quite calmly and collectedly, and weighs the probabilities of hitting and of being hit. Altogether, the fight itself is the least exciting part of the business as a rule. He who gets excited in fighting is sure to make mistakes. He will never get his enemy down. Besides, calmness is, after all, a matter of habit. At any rate, in this case, I did not make a mistake. I approached my man up to 50 yards. Then I fired some well-aimed shots and thought that I was bound to be successful. That was my idea. But suddenly I heard a tremendous bang when I had scarcely fired 10 cartridges. Presently again something hit my machine. It became clear to me that I had been hit, or rather my machine. At the same time I noticed a fearful benzine stench, and I observed that the motor was running slack. The Englishman noticed it too, for he started shooting with redoubled energy while I had to stop it. I went right down. Instinctively I switched off the engine, and indeed it was high time to do this. When a pilot's benzine tank has been perforated, and when the infernal liquid is squirting around his legs, the danger of fire is very great. In front is an explosive engine of more than 150 horsepower, which is red hot. If a single drop of benzine should fall on it, the whole machine would be in flames. I left in the air a thin white cloud. I knew its meaning from my enemies. Its appearance is the first sign of a coming explosion. I was at an altitude of 9,000 feet and had to travel a long distance to get down. By the kindness of Providence, my engine stopped running. I have no idea with what rapidity I went downward. At any rate, the speed was so great that I could not put my head out of the machine without being pressed back by the rush of air. Soon I lost sight of my enemy. I had only time to see what my four comrades were doing while I was dropping to the ground. They were still fighting. Their machine guns and those of their opponents could be heard. Suddenly I noticed a rocket. Is it a signal of the enemy? No, it cannot be. The light is too great for a rocket. Evidently a machine is on fire. What machine? The burning machine looks exactly as if it were one of our own. No, praise the Lord, it is one of the enemy's. Who can have shot him down? Immediately afterwards, a second machine drops out and falls perpendicularly to the ground, turning exactly as I did. But suddenly it recovers its balance. It flies straight towards me. It also is an albatross. No doubt it had the same experience as I had. I had fallen to an altitude of perhaps 1,000 feet and had to look out for a landing. Now such a sudden landing usually leads to breakages, and as these are occasionally serious, it was time to look out. I found a meadow. It was not very large, but it just sufficed if I used due caution. Besides, it was favorably situated on the high road near Ch8-13. There I meant to land. Everything went as desired, and my first thought was, what has become of the other fellow? He landed a few kilometers from the spot where I had come to the ground. I had ample time to inspect the damage. My machine had been hit a number of times. The shot which caused me to give up the fight had gone through both benzine tanks. I had not a drop of benzine left, and the engine itself had also been damaged by shots. It was a pity, for it had worked so well. I let my legs dangle out of the machine and probably made a very silly face. In a moment I was surrounded by a large crowd of soldiers. Then came an officer. He was quite out of breath. He was terribly excited. No doubt something fearful had happened to him. He rushed towards me, gasped for air and asked, "I hope that nothing has happened to you. I have followed the whole affair and am terribly excited. Good Lord, it looked awful." I assured him that I felt quite well, jumped down from the side of my machine and introduced myself to him. Of course, he did not understand a particle of my name. However, he invited me to go in his motor car to Ch8-13, where he was quartered. He was an engineer officer. We were sitting in the motor and were commencing our ride. My host was still extraordinarily excited. Suddenly he jumped up and asked, "Good Lord, but where is your chauffeur?" At first I did not quite understand what he meant. Probably I looked puzzled. Then it dawned upon me that he thought I was the observer of a two-seater, and that he asked after the fate of my pilot. I pulled myself together and said in the driest tones, "I always drive myself." Of course the word drive is absolutely taboo among the flying men. An aviator does not drive, he flies. In the eyes of the kind gentleman I had obviously lost caste when he discovered that I drove my own aeroplane. The conversation began to slacken. We arrived in his quarters. I was still dressed in my dirty and oily leather jacket and had round my neck a thick wrap. On our journey he had of course asked me a tremendous number of questions. Altogether he was far more excited than I was. When we got to his diggings he forced me to lie down on the sofa, or at least he tried to force me because, he argued, I was bound to be terribly done up through my fight. I assured him that this was not my first aerial battle, but he did not apparently give me much credence. Probably I did not look very martial. After we had been talking for some time, he asked me, of course, the celebrated question, "Have you ever brought down a machine?" As I said before, he had probably not understood my name. So I answered nonchalantly, "Oh yes, I have done so now and then." He replied, "Indeed? Perhaps you have shot down two?" I answered, "No, not two, but 24. He smiled, repeated his question, and gave me to understand that when he was speaking about shooting down an aeroplane, he meant not shooting at an aeroplane, but shooting into an aeroplane in such a manner that it would fall to the ground and remain there. I immediately assured him that I entirely shared his conception of the meaning of the words shooting down. Now I had completely lost caste with him. He was convinced that I was a fearful liar. He left me sitting where I was, and told me that a meal would be served in an hour. If I liked, I could join in. I accepted his invitation and slept soundly for an hour. Then we went to the officers' club. Arrived at the club, I was glad to find that I was wearing the Ordre pour le Mérite. Unfortunately, I had no uniform jacket underneath my greasy leather, but only a waistcoat. I apologized for being so badly dressed. Suddenly my good chief discovered on me the Ordre pour le Mérite. He was speechless with surprise, and assured me that he did not know my name. I gave him my name once more. Now it seemed to dawn upon him that he had heard my name before. He feasted me with oysters and champagne, and I did gloriously until at last my orderly arrived and fetched me with my car. I learned from him that Comrade Lupert had once more justified his nickname. He was generally called the bullet catcher, for his machine suffered badly in every fight. Once it was hit 64 times, yet he had not been wounded. This time he had received a glancing shot on the chest, and he was by this time in hospital. I flew his machine to port. Unfortunately, this excellent officer, who promised to become another Boelcke, died a few weeks later, a hero's death for the fatherland. In the evening I could assure my kind host of Lenin Littard that I had increased my bag to 25. End of chapter 9. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com. Chapters 10 and 11 of The Red Battle Flyer by Captain Manfred von Richthofen. Translated by T.L.S. Barker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 10. A Flying Man's Adventure. End of March 1917. The name Siegfried Position is probably known to every young man in Germany. During the time when we withdrew towards the Siegfried Line, the activity in the air was, of course, very great. We allowed our enemies to occupy the territory which we had evacuated, but we did not allow them to occupy the air as well. The chaser squadron which Boelcke had trained looked after the English flying men. The English had hitherto fought a war of position in the air, and they ventured to abandon it for a war of movement only with the utmost caution. That was the time when Prince Frederick Charles gave his life for the fatherland. In the course of a hunting expedition of the Boelcke chaser squadron, Lieutenant Voss had defeated an Englishman in an aerial duel. He was forced to go down to the ground and landed in neutral territory between the lines in no man's land. In this particular case we had abandoned a stretch of territory, but the enemy had not yet occupied it. Only English and German patrols were about in the unoccupied zone. The English flying machine was standing between the two lines. Our good Englishman probably believed that the ground was already in English possession, and he was justified in thinking so. Lieutenant Voss was of a different opinion. Without a moment's hesitation he landed close to his victim. With great rapidity he transferred the Englishman's machine guns and other useful things to his own aeroplane, took a match, and in a few minutes the English machine stood in flames. Then he waved smilingly from his victorious aeroplane to the English, who were rushing along from all sides, and was off. My first double event. The 2nd of April, 1917, was a very warm day for my squadron. From my quarters I could clearly hear the drum fire of the guns, which was again particularly violent. I was still in bed when my orderly rushed into the room and exclaimed, "Sir, the English are here!" Sleepy as I was, I looked out of the window, and really there were my dear friends circling over the flying ground. I jumped out of my bed and into my clothes in a jiffy. My red bird had been pulled out and was ready for starting. My mechanics knew that I should probably not allow such a favorable moment to go by unutilized. Everything was ready. I snatched up my furs and then went off. I was the last to start. My comrades were much nearer to the enemy. I feared that my prey would escape me, that I should have to look on from a distance while the others were fighting. Suddenly one of the impertinent fellows tried to drop down upon me. I allowed him to come near, and then we started a merry quadrille. Sometimes my opponent flew on his back, and sometimes he did other tricks. He had a double-seated chaser. I was his master, and very soon I recognized that he could not escape me. During an interval in the fighting, I convinced myself that we were alone. It followed that the victory would accrue to him who was calmest, who shot best, and who had the clearest brain in a moment of danger. After a short time I got him beneath me without seriously hurting him with my gun. We were at least 2 kilometers from the front. I thought he intended to land, but there I had made a mistake. Suddenly, when he was only a few yards above the ground, he once more went off on a straight course. He tried to escape me. That was too bad. I attacked him again, and I went so low that I feared I should touch the roofs of the houses of the village beneath me. The Englishman defended himself up to the last moment. At the very end, I felt that my engine had been hit. Still I did not let go. He had to fall. He rushed at full speed right into a block of houses. There was little left to be done. This was once more a case of splendid daring. He defended himself to the last. However, in my opinion, he showed more foolhardiness than courage. This was one of the cases where one must differentiate between energy and idiocy. He had to come down in any case, but he paid for his stupidity with his life. I was delighted with the performance of my red machine during its morning work and returned to our quarters. My comrades were still in the air, and they were very surprised when, as we met at breakfast, I told them that I had scored my 32nd machine. A very young lieutenant had bagged his first aeroplane. We were all very merry and prepared everything for further battles. I then went and groomed myself. I had not had time to do it previously. I was visited by a dear friend, Lieutenant Voss of Boelke's squadron. We chatted. Voss had downed on the previous day his 23rd machine. He was next to me on the list and is at present my most redoubtable competitor. When he started to fly home, I offered to accompany him part of the way. We went on a roundabout way over the fronts. The weather had turned so bad that we could not hope to find any more game. Beneath us there were dense clouds. Voss did not know the country, and he began to feel uncomfortable. When we passed above Arras, I met my brother, who also was in my squadron and who had lost his way. He joined us. Of course, he recognized me at once by the color of my machine. Suddenly we saw a squadron approaching from the other side. Immediately the thought occurred to me, now comes number 33. Although there were 9 Englishmen, and although they were on their own territory, they preferred to avoid battle. I thought that perhaps it would be better for me to repaint my machine. Nevertheless, we caught them up. The important thing in aeroplanes is that they are speedy. I am nearest to the enemy and attacked the man to the rear. To my greatest delight I noticed that he accepted battle, and my pleasure was increased when I discovered that his comrades deserted him. So I had once more a single fight. It was a fight similar to the one which I had had in the morning. My opponent did not make matters easy for me. He knew the fighting business, and it was particularly awkward for me that he was a good shot. To my great regret, that was quite clear to me. A favorable wind came to my aid. It drove both of us into the German lines. My opponent discovered that the matter was not so simple as he had imagined. So he plunged and disappeared into a cloud. He had nearly saved himself. I plunged after him and dropped out of the cloud, and as luck would have it, found myself close behind him. I fired and he fired without any tangible result. At last I hit him. I noticed a ribbon of white benzine vapor. He had to land, for his engine had come to a stop. He was a stubborn fellow. He was bound to recognize that he had lost the game. If he continued shooting I could kill him, for meanwhile we had dropped to an altitude of about 900 feet. However, the Englishman defended himself exactly as did his fellow countryman in the morning. He fought until he landed. When he had come to the ground, I flew over him at an altitude of about 35 feet in order to ascertain whether I had killed him or not. What did the rascal do? He took his machine gun and shot holes into my machine. Afterwards, Voss told me that if it had happened to him, he would have shot the airman on the ground. As a matter of fact, I ought to have done so, for he had not surrendered. He was one of the few fortunate fellows who escaped with their lives. I felt very merry, flew home, and celebrated my 33rd aeroplane. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. My record day. The weather was glorious. We were ready for starting. I had as a visitor a gentleman who had never seen a fight in the air, or anything resembling it, and he had just assured me that it would tremendously interest him to witness an aerial battle. We climbed into our machines and laughed heartily at our visitor's eagerness. Friend Schäfer thought that we might give him some fun. We placed him before a telescope, and off we went. The day began well. We had scarcely flown to an altitude of 6,000 feet when an English squadron of 5 machines was seen coming our way. We attacked them by a rush as if we were cavalry, and the hostile squadron lay destroyed on the ground. None of our men was even wounded. Of our enemies, 3 had plunged to the ground and 2 had come down in flames. The good fellow down below was not a little surprised. He had imagined that the affair would look quite different, that it would be far more dramatic. He thought the whole encounter had looked quite harmless, until suddenly some machines came falling down, looking like rockets. I have gradually become accustomed to seeing machines falling down, but I must say it impressed me very deeply when I saw the first Englishman fall, and I have often seen the event again in my dreams. As the day had begun so propitiously, we sat down and had a decent breakfast. All of us were as hungry as wolves. In the meantime, our machines were again made ready for starting. Fresh cartridges were got, and then we went off again. In the evening we could send off the proud report: 6 German machines have destroyed 13 hostile aeroplanes. Boelcke's squadron had only once been able to make a similar report. At that time we had shot down 8 machines. Today one of us had brought low 4 of his opponents. The hero was a Lieutenant Wolff, a delicate-looking little fellow in whom nobody could have suspected a redoubtable hero. My brother had destroyed 2, Schäfer 2, Festner 2, and I 3. We went to bed in the evening tremendously proud, but also terribly tired. On the following day we read with noisy approval about our deeds of the previous day in the official communiqué. On the next day we downed 8 hostile machines. A very amusing thing occurred. One of the Englishmen whom we had shot down and whom we had made a prisoner was talking with us. Of course, he inquired after the red aeroplane. It is not unknown even among the troops in the trenches, and is called by them Le Diable Rouge. In the squadron to which he belonged there was a rumour that the red machine was occupied by a girl, by a kind of Jeanne d'Arc. He was intensely surprised when I assured him that the supposed girl was standing in front of him. He did not intend to make a joke. He was actually convinced that only a girl could sit in the extravagantly painted machine. Moritz. The most beautiful being in all creation is the genuine Danish hound, my little lapdog, my Moritz. I bought him in Ostend from a brave Belgian for 5 marks. His mother was a beautiful animal, and one of his fathers also was purebred. I am convinced of that. I could select one of the litter, and I chose the prettiest. Zoomer took another puppy and called it Max. Max came to a sudden end. He was run over by a motor car. Moritz flourished exceedingly. He slept with me in my bed and received a most excellent education. He never left me while I was in Ostend and obtained my entire affection. Month by month Moritz grew, and gradually my tender little lapdog became a colossal big beast. Once I even took him with me. He was my first observer. He behaved very sensibly. He seemed much interested in everything, and looked at the world from above. Only my mechanics were dissatisfied when they had to clean the machine. Afterwards Moritz was very merry. Moritz is more than a year old, and he is still as childlike as if he were still in his teens. He is very fond of playing billiards. In doing this he has destroyed many billiard balls, and particularly many a billiard cloth. He has a great passion for the chase. My mechanics are highly satisfied with his sporting inclinations, for he has caught for them many a nice hare. I do not much approve of his hunting proclivities. Constantly he gets a whacking if I catch him at it. He has a silly peculiarity. He likes to accompany the flying machines at the start. Frequently the normal death of a flying man's dog is death from the propeller. One day he rushed in front of a flying machine which had been started. The aeroplane caught him up, and a beautiful propeller was smashed to bits. Moritz howled terribly, and a measure which I had hitherto admitted was taken. I had always refused to have his ears cut. One of his ears was cut off by the propeller. A long ear and a short ear do not go well together. Moritz has taken a very sensible view of the World War and of our enemies. When in the summer of 1916 he saw for the first time Russian natives, the train had stopped and Moritz was being taken for a walk. He chased the Russian crowd with loud barking. He has no great opinion of Frenchmen, although he is, after all, a Belgian. Once, when I had settled in new quarters, I ordered the people to clean the house. When I came back in the evening, nothing had been done. I got angry and asked the Frenchman to come and see me. When he opened the door, Moritz greeted him rather brusquely. Immediately, I understood why no cleaning had been done. The English attack our aerodrome. Nights in which the full moon is shining are most suitable for night flying. During the full moon nights of the month of April, our English friends were particularly industrious. This was during the Battle of Arras. Probably they had found out that we had comfortably installed ourselves on a beautiful large flying ground at Douai. One night when we were in the officers' mess, the telephone started ringing and we were told the English are coming. There was a great hullabaloo. We had bomb-proof shelters. They had been got ready by our excellent Simon. Simon is our architect, surveyor and builder. We dived down into shelter and we heard actually, at first a very gentle humming and then the noise of engines. The searchlights had apparently got notice at the same time as we, for they started getting ready. The nearest enemy was still too far away to be attacked. We were colossally merry. The only thing we feared was that the English would not succeed in finding our aerodrome. To find some fixed spot at night is by no means easy. It was particularly difficult to find us because our aerodrome was not situated on an important highway or near water or a railway by which one could be guided during one's flight at night. The Englishmen were apparently flying at a great altitude. At first they circled around our entire establishment. We began to think that they had given up and were looking for another objective. Suddenly we noticed that the nearest one had switched off his engine. So he was coming lower. Wolff said, "Now the matter is becoming serious." We had 2 carbines and began shooting at the Englishman. We could not see him. Still the noise of our shooting was a sedative to our nerves. Suddenly he was taken up by the searchlights. There was shouting all over the flying ground. Our friend was sitting in a prehistoric packing case. We could clearly recognize the type. He was half a mile away from us and was flying straight towards us. He went lower and lower. At last he had come down to an altitude of about 300 feet. Then he started his engine again and came straight towards the spot where we were standing. Wolff thought that he took an interest in the other side of our establishment, and before long the first bomb fell, and it was followed by a number of other missiles. Our friend amused us with very pretty fireworks. They could have frightened only a coward. Broadly speaking, I find that bomb throwing at night has only a moral effect. Those who are easily frightened are strongly affected when bombs fall at night. The others don't care. We were much amused at the Englishman's performance and thought the English would come quite often on a visit. The flying piano dropped its bombs at last from an altitude of 150 feet. That was rather impertinent, for in a moonlit night I think I can hit a wild pig at 150 feet with a rifle. Why then should I not succeed in hitting the Englishman? It would have been a novelty to down an Englishman from the ground. From above I had already had the honor of downing a number of Englishmen, but I have never tried to tackle an aviator from below. When the Englishman had gone, we went back to the mess and discussed among ourselves how we should receive the English should they pay us another visit on the following night. In the course of the next day our orderlies and other fellows were made to work with great energy. They had to ram into the ground piles which were to be used as a foundation for machine guns during the coming night. We went to the butts and tried the English machine guns which we had taken from the enemy, arranged the sights for night shooting, and were very curious as to what was going to happen. I will not betray the number of our machine guns. Anyhow, they were to be sufficient for the purpose. Every one of my officers was armed with one. We were again sitting at mess. Of course, we were discussing the problem of night flyers. Suddenly an orderly rushed in shouting, "They are there! They are there!" and disappeared in the next bomb-proof in his scanty attire. We all rushed to our machine guns. Some of the men who were known to be good shots had also been given a machine gun. All the rest were provided with carbines. The whole squadron was armed to the teeth to give a warm reception to our kindly visitors. The first Englishman arrived, exactly as on the previous evening, at a very great altitude. He went then down to 150 feet, and to our greatest joy began making for the place where our barracks were. He got into the glare of the searchlight. When he was only 300 yards away, someone fired the first shot, and all the rest of us joined in. A rush of cavalry or of storming troops could not have been met more efficiently than the attack of that single impertinent individual flying at 150 feet. Quick firing from many guns received him. Of course, he could not hear the noise of the machine guns. The roar of his motor prevented that. However, he must have seen the flashes of our guns. Therefore, I thought it tremendously plucky that our man did not swerve, but continued going straight ahead in accordance with his plan. At the moment he was perpendicularly above us, we jumped quickly into our bomb-proof. It would have been too silly for flying men to die by a rotten bomb. As soon as he had passed over our heads, we rushed out again and fired after him with our machine guns and rifle. Friend Ch8-13 asserted that he had hit the man. Ch8-13 is quite a good shot. Still, in this case, I did not believe him. Besides, every one of us had as good a chance at making a hit as he had. We had achieved something, for the enemy had dropped his bombs rather aimlessly owing to our shooting. One of them, it is true, had exploded only a few yards from the Petit Rouget, but had not hurt him. During the night the fun recommenced several times. I was already in bed, fast asleep, when I heard in a dream anti-aircraft firing. I woke up and discovered that the dream was reality. One of the Englishmen flew at so low an altitude over my habitation that in my fright I pulled the blanket over my head. The next moment I heard an incredible bang just outside my window. The panes had fallen a victim to the bomb. I rushed out of my room in my shirt in order to fire a few shots after him. They were firing from everywhere. Unfortunately, I had overslept my opportunity. The next morning we were extremely surprised and delighted to discover that we had shot down from the ground no fewer than 3 Englishmen. They had landed not far from our aerodrome and had been made prisoners. As a rule, we had hit the engines and had forced the airmen to come down on our side of the front. After all, Ch8-13 was possibly right in his assertion. At any rate, we were very well satisfied with our success. The English were distinctly less satisfied, for they preferred avoiding our base. It was a pity that they gave us a wide berth, for they gave us lots of fun. Let us hope that they come back to us next month. End of chapter 11. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudiobooks.com. Chapters 12 and 13 of The Red Battle Flyer by Captain Manfred von Richthofen. Translated by T.L.S. Barker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 12. Ch8-13 lands between the lines. We went on a shooting expedition on the 20th of April. We came home very late and lost Ch8-13 on the way. Of course, everyone hoped that he would come to hand before dark. It struck 9, it struck 10, but no Ch8-13 was visible. His benzine could not last so long. Consequently, he had landed somewhere, for no one was willing to admit that he had been shot down. No one dared to mention the possibility. Still, everyone was afraid for him. The ubiquitous telephone was set in motion in order to find out whether a flying man had come down anywhere. Nobody could give us information. No division and no brigade had seen anything of him. We felt very uncomfortable. At last we went to bed. All of us were perfectly convinced that he would turn up in the end. At 2 o'clock after midnight I was suddenly awakened. The telephone orderly, beaming with pleasure, reported to me, "Ch8-13 is in the village of Y and would like to be fetched home." The next morning when we were sitting at breakfast the door opened and my dear pilot stood before me. His clothes were as filthy as those of an infantryman who has fought at Arras for a fortnight. He was greeted with a general hurrah. Ch8-13 was tremendously happy and elated and tremendously excited about his adventure. When he had finished his breakfast, he told us the following tale. I was flying along the front, intending to return home. Suddenly I noticed far below me something that looked like an infantry flyer. I attacked him, shot him down, and meant to fly back. However, the English in the trenches did not mean me to get away, and started peppering me like anything. My salvation lay in the rapidity of my machine, for those rascals of course would forget that they had to aim far in front of me if they wished to hit me. I was at an altitude of perhaps 600 feet. Suddenly I heard a smash and my engine stopped running. There was nothing to do but land. I asked myself whether I should be able to get away from the English position. It seemed very questionable. The English noticed my predicament and started shooting like mad. As my engine was no longer running, I could hear every single shot. The position became awkward. I came down and landed. Before my machine had come to a standstill, they squirted upon me heaps of bullets from machine guns in the hedge of the village of Monchy near Arras. My machine became splashed with bullets. I jumped out of it and down into the first shell hole. Squatting there, I reflected and tried to realize exactly where I was. Gradually it became clear to me that I had landed outside the English lines, but cursedly near them. Happily it was rather late in the evening, and that was my salvation. Before long the first shell came along. Of course they were gas shells, and I had no mask with me. My eyes started watering like anything. Before darkness set in, the English ascertained the distance of the spot where I had landed with machine guns. Part of them aimed at my machine and part at my shell crater. The bullets constantly hit its rim. In order to quiet my nerves, I lit a cigarette. Then I took off my heavy fur coat and prepared everything for a leap and a run. Every minute seemed to me an hour. Gradually it became dark, but only very gradually. Around me I heard partridges giving a concert. As an experienced shot, I recognized from their voices that they felt quite happy and contented, that there was no danger of my being surprised in my hiding place. At last it became quite dark. Suddenly and quite close to me a couple of partridges flew up. A second couple followed. It was obvious that danger was approaching. No doubt a patrol was on the way to wish me a happy evening. I had no time to lose, now or never. First I crept very cautiously in my chest from shell hole to shell hole. After creeping industriously for about an hour and a half, I noticed I was nearing humans. Were they English or were they Germans? They came nearer, and I could almost have fallen round their necks when I discovered our own musketeers. They were a German patrol who were nosing about in no man's land. One of the men conducted me to the commander of his company. I was told that in the evening I had landed about 50 yards in front of the enemy lines, and that our infantry had given me up for lost. I had a good supper, and then I started on my way home. Behind me there was far more shooting than in front of me. Every path, every trench, every bush, every hollow was under enemy fire. The English attacked on the next morning, and consequently they had to begin their artillery preparation the evening before. So I had chosen an unfavorable day for my enterprise. I reached the first telephone only at 2 o'clock in the morning, when I phoned to the squadron. We were all very happy to have our Schäfer again with us. We went to bed. Any other man would have taken a rest from flying for 24 hours. But on the afternoon of this very day, friend Schäfer attacked a low-flying BE above Monchy. The anti-Richthofen squadron. The English had hit upon a splendid joke. They intended to catch me or to bring me down. For that purpose they had actually organized a special squadron which flew about in that part which we frequented as a rule. We discovered its particular aim by the fact that its aggressive activity was principally directed against our red machines. I would say that all the machines of the squadron had been painted red because our English friends had by and by perceived that I was sitting in a blood-red bandbox. Suddenly there were quite a lot of red machines, and the English opened their eyes wide when one fine day they saw a dozen red barges streaming along instead of a single one. Our new trick did not prevent them from making an attempt at attacking us. I preferred their new tactics. It is better that one's customers come to one's shop than to have to look for them abroad. We flew to the front hoping to find our enemy. After about 20 minutes the first arrived and attacked us. That had not happened to us for a long time. The English had abandoned their celebrated offensive tactics to some extent. They had found them somewhat too expensive. Our aggressors were 3 Spad one-seater machines. Their occupants thought themselves very superior to us because of the excellence of their apparatus. Wolff, my brother, and I were flying together. We were 3 against 3. That was as it ought to be. Immediately at the beginning of the encounter, the aggressive became a defensive. Our superiority became clear. I tackled my opponent and could see how my brother and Wolff handled each his own enemy. The usual waltzing began. We were circling around one another. A favorable wind came to our aid. It drove us fighting away from the front in the direction of Germany. My man was the first who fell down. I suppose I had smashed up his machine. At any rate, he made up his mind to land. I no longer gave pardon to him. Therefore I attacked him a second time, and the consequence was that his whole machine went to pieces. His planes dropped off like pieces of paper, and the body of the machine fell like a stone burning fiercely. It dropped into a morass. It was impossible to dig it out, and I have never discovered the name of my opponent. He had disappeared. Only the end of the tail was visible and marked the place where he had dug his own grave. Simultaneously with me, Wolff and my brother had attacked their opponents and had forced them to land not far from my victim. We were very happy and flew home and hoped that the anti-Richthofen squadron would often return to the fray. We are visited by my father. My father had announced that he would visit his 2 sons on the 29th of April. My father is a commander of a little town in the vicinity of Lille. Therefore he does not live very far away from us. I have occasionally seen him on my flights. He intended to arrive by train at 9 o'clock. At 9:30 he came to our aerodrome. We just happened to have returned from an expedition. My brother was the first to climb out of his machine, and he greeted the old gentleman with the words, "Good day, father. I have just shot down an Englishman." Immediately afterward, I also climbed out of my machine and greeted him, "Good day, father. I have just shot down an Englishman." The old gentleman felt very happy and he was delighted. That was obvious. He is not one of those fathers who are afraid for their sons. I think he would like best to get into a machine himself and help us shoot. We breakfasted with him and then went flying again. In the meantime, an aerial fight took place above our aerodrome. My father looked on and was greatly interested. We did not take a hand in the fight, for we were standing on the ground and looked on ourselves. An English squadron had broken through and was being attacked above our aerodrome by some of our own reconnoitering aeroplanes. Suddenly one of the machines started turning over and over. Then it recovered itself and came gliding down normally. We saw with regret this time that it was a German machine. The Englishman flew on. The German aeroplane had apparently been damaged. It was quite correctly handled. It came down and tried to land on our flying ground. The room was rather narrow for the large machine. Besides, the ground was unfamiliar to the pilot. Hence the landing was not quite smooth. We ran towards the aeroplane and discovered with regret that one of the occupants of the machine gunner, had been killed. The spectacle was new to my father. It made him serious. The day promised to be a favorable one for us. The weather was wonderfully clear. The anti-aircraft guns were constantly audible. Obviously there was much aircraft about. Towards midday we flew once more. This time I was again lucky and shot down my second Englishman of the day. The governor recovered his good spirits. After the midday dinner I slept a little. I was again quite fresh. Wolff had fought the enemy in the meantime with his group of machines and had himself bagged an enemy. Schäfer also had eaten one. In the afternoon my brother and I, accompanied by Schäfer, Festner and Allmenröder, flew twice more. The first afternoon flight was a failure. The second was all the better. Soon after we had come to the front, a hostile squadron met us. Unfortunately, they occupied a higher altitude, so we could not do anything. We tried to climb to their level, but did not succeed. We had to let them go. We flew along the front. My brother was next to me, in front of the others. Suddenly I noticed two hostile artillery flyers approaching our front in the most impertinent and provocative manner. I waved to my brother, and he understood my meaning. We flew side by side, increasing our speed. Each of us felt certain that he was superior to the enemy. It was a great thing that we could absolutely rely on one another, and that was the principal thing. One has to know one's flying partner. My brother was the first to approach his enemy. He attacked the first, and I took care of the second. At the last moment, I quickly looked round in order to feel sure that there was no third aeroplane about. We were alone and could see eye to eye. Soon I had got on the favourable side of my opponent. A short spell of quick firing, and the enemy machine went to pieces. I never had a more rapid success. While I was still looking where my enemy's fragments were falling, I noticed my brother. He was scarcely 500 yards away from me, and was still fighting his opponent. I had time to study the struggle, and must say that I myself could not have done any better than he did. He had rushed his man, and both were turning around one another. Suddenly the enemy machine reared. That is a certain indication of a hit. Probably the pilot was shot in the head. The machine fell, and the planes of the enemy apparatus went to pieces. They fell quite close to my victim. I flew towards my brother, and we congratulated one another by waving. We were highly satisfied with our performance and flew off. It is a splendid thing when one can fly together with one's brother, and do so well. In the meantime, the other fellows of the squadron had drawn near and were watching the spectacle of the fight of the two brothers. Of course, they could not help us, for only one man can shoot down an opponent. If one airman has tackled his enemy, the others cannot assist. They can only look on and protect his back. Otherwise, he might be attacked in the rear. We flew on and went on to a higher altitude, for there was apparently a meeting somewhere in the air for the members of the anti-Richthofen club. They could recognize us from far away. In the powerful sunlight, the beautiful red color of our machines could be seen at a long distance. We closed our ranks, for we knew that our English friends pursued the same business as we. Unfortunately, they were again too high, so we had to wait for their attack. The celebrated triplanes and Spads were perfectly new machines. However, the quality of the box matters little. Success depends upon the man who sits in it. The English airmen played a cautious game, but would not bite. We offered to fight them, either on one side of the front or on the other, but they said, "No, thank you. What is the good of bringing out a squadron against us and then turning tail?" At last one of the men plucked up courage and dropped down upon our rear machine. Naturally, battle was accepted, although our position was unfavorable. If you wish to do business, you must, after all, adapt yourself to the desires of your customers. Therefore, we all turned round. The Englishman noticed what was going on and got away. The battle had begun. Another Englishman tried a similar trick on me, and I greeted him at once with quick fire from my two machine guns. He tried to escape me by dropping down. That was fatal to him. When he got beneath me, I remained on top of him. Everything in the air that is beneath me, especially if it is a one-seater, a chaser, is lost, for it cannot shoot to the rear. My opponent had a very good and very fast machine. However, he did not succeed in reaching the English lines. I began to fire at him when we were above Lens. I started shooting when I was much too far away. That was merely a trick of mine. I did not mean so much to hit him as to frighten him, and I succeeded in catching him. He began flying curves, and this enabled me to draw near. I tried the same maneuver a second and a third time. Every time my foolish friend started making his curves, I gradually edged quite close to him. I approached him almost to touching distance. I aimed very carefully. I waited a moment, and when I was at most a distance of 50 yards from him, I started with both the machine guns at the same time. I heard a slight hissing noise, a certain sign that the benzine tanks had been hit. Then I saw a bright flame, and my lord disappeared below. This was the fourth victim of the day. My brother had bagged two. Apparently we had invited our father to a treat. His joy was wonderful. I had invited several gentlemen for the evening. Among these was my dear Wedel, who happened to be in the neighbourhood. We had a great treat. The two brothers had bagged 6 Englishmen in a single day. That is a whole flying squadron. I believe the English ceased to feel any sympathy for us. I fly home. I had shot down 50 aeroplanes. That was a good number, but I would have preferred 52. So I went up one day and had another 2, although it was against orders. As a matter of fact, I had been allowed to bag only 41. Anyone will be able to guess why the number was fixed at 41. Just for that reason, I wanted to avoid that figure. I am not out for breaking records. Besides, generally speaking, we of the Flying Corps do not think of records at all. We merely think of our duty. Boelcke might have shot down 100 aeroplanes but for his accident, and many others of our dear dead comrades might have vastly increased their bag but for their sudden death. Still, it is some fun to have downed half 100 aeroplanes. After all, I had succeeded in obtaining permission to bring down 50 machines before going on leave. I hope that I may live to celebrate a second lot of 50. In the evening of that particular day, the telephone bell was ringing. Headquarters wished to speak to me. It seemed to me the height of fun to be connected with the Holy of Holies. Over the wire they gave me the cheerful news that His Majesty had expressed the wish to make my personal acquaintance and had fixed the date for me. I had to make an appearance on the 2nd of May. The notification reached me on the 30th of April at 9 o'clock in the evening. I should not have been able to fulfill the wish of our all-highest warlord by taking the train. I therefore thought I would travel by air, especially as that mode of locomotion is far pleasanter. I started the next morning, not in my single-seater Le Petit Rouget, but in a big fat double-seater. I took a seat at the rear, not the sticks. The man who had to do the flying was Lieutenant Krefft, one of the officers of my squadron. He was just going on furlough to recover his strength, so that it suited him admirably to act as my pilot. We reached home more quickly, traveling by air, and he preferred the trip by aeroplane. I started on the journey rather hastily. The only luggage which I took with me was my toothbrush. Therefore I had to dress for the journey in the clothes in which I was to appear at headquarters. Now, a soldier does not carry with him many beautiful uniforms when he goes to war, and the scarcity of nice clothes is particularly great in the case of such a poor front hog as myself. My brother undertook the command of the aeroplane squadron in my absence. I took leave with a few words, for I hoped soon to recommence my work among those dear fellows. The flight went via Namur, Liège, Aix-la-Chapelle and Cologne. It was lovely for once to sail through the air without any thoughts of war. The weather was wonderful. We had rarely had such a perfect time. Probably the men at the front would be extremely busy. Soon our own captive balloons were lost to sight. The thunder of the Battle of Arras was only heard in the distance. Beneath us all was peace. We saw steamers on the rivers and fast trains on the railways. We easily overtook everything below. The wind was in our favour. The earth seemed as flat as a threshing floor. The beautiful mountains of the Meuse were not recognizable as mountains. One could not even trace them by their shadows, for the sun was right above us. We only knew that they were there, and with a little imagination we could hide ourselves in the cool glades of that delightful country. It had become late. Clouds were gathering below and hid us from the earth. We flew on, taking our directions by means of the sun and the compass. The vicinity of Holland was disagreeable to us. We decided to go lower in order to find out where we were. We went beneath the cloud and discovered that we were above Namur. We then went on to Aix-la-Chapelle. We left that town to our left, and about midday we reached Cologne. We both were in high spirits. We had before us a long leave of absence. The weather was beautiful. We had succeeded in all our undertakings. We had reached Cologne. We could be certain to get to headquarters in time, whatever might happen. Our coming had been announced in Cologne by telegram. People were looking out for us. On the previous day the newspapers had reported my 52nd aerial victory. One can imagine what kind of a reception they had prepared for us. Having been flying for 3 hours, I had a slight headache. Therefore, I thought I would take 40 winks before going to headquarters. From Cologne we flew along the Rhine for some distance. I knew the country well. I had often journeyed that way by steamer, by motor car, and by railway, and now I was traveling by aeroplane. It is difficult to say which of these is the most pleasant form of locomotion. Of course, one can see the details of the landscape better from the steamer. However, the commanding view one gets from an aeroplane has also its attractions. The Rhine is a very beautiful river, from above as well as from any other viewpoint. We flew rather low in order not to lose the sensation that we were traveling among mountains, for after all the most beautiful part of the Rhine are the tree-clad hills and castles. Of course, we could not make out individual houses. It is a pity that one cannot fly slowly and quickly. If it had been possible, I would have flown quite slowly. The beautiful views which we saw vanished only too quickly. Nevertheless, when one flies high in the air, one never has the sensation that one is proceeding at a fast pace. If you are sitting in a motor car or in a fast train, you have the impression of tremendous speed. On the other hand, you seem to be advancing slowly when you fly in an aeroplane at a considerable speed. You notice the celerity of your progress only when you have not looked out of your machine for 4 or 5 minutes, and then try to find out where you are. Then the aspect of the country appears suddenly completely changed. The terrain which you passed over a little while ago looks quite different under a different angle, and you do not recognize the scenery you have passed. Herein lies the reason that an airman can easily lose his way if he forgets for a moment to examine the territory. In the afternoon we arrived at headquarters and were cordially received by some comrades with whom I was acquainted and who had worked at the holiest of holies. I absolutely pity those poor ink spillers. They get only half the fun in war. First of all, I went to the general commanding the air forces. On the next morning came the great moment when I was to meet Hindenburg and Ludendorff. I had to wait for quite a while. I should find it difficult to describe my encounter with these generals. I saw Hindenburg first, and then Ludendorff. It is a weird feeling to be in the room where the fate of the world is decided. I was quite glad when I was again outside the holiest of holies, and when I had been commanded to lunch with His Majesty. The day was the day of my birth, and somebody had apparently told His Majesty. He congratulated me in the first place on my success, and in the second on my 25th birthday. At the same time he handed me a small birthday present. Formerly I would never have believed it possible that on my 25th birthday I would be sitting at the right of General Field Marshal von Hindenburg, and that I would be mentioned by him in his speech. On the day following I was to take midday dinner with Her Majesty, and so I went to Homburg. Her Majesty also gave me a birthday present, and I had the great pleasure to show her how to start an aeroplane. In the evening I was again invited by General Field Marshal von Hindenburg. The day following I flew to Freiburg to do some shooting. At Freiburg I made use of the flying machine which was going to Berlin by air. In Nuremberg I replenished my tanks with benzine. A thunderstorm was coming on. I was in a great hurry to get to Berlin. Various more or less interesting things awaited me there. So I flew on, the thunderstorm notwithstanding. I enjoyed the clouds and the beastly weather. The rain fell in streams. Sometimes it hailed. Always the propeller had the most extraordinary aspect. The hailstones had damaged it considerably. The blades looked like saws. Unfortunately, I enjoyed the bad weather so much that I quite forgot to look about me. When I remembered that one has to look out, it was too late. I had no longer any idea where I was. That was a nice position to be in. I had lost my way in my own country. My people at home would laugh when they knew it. However, there it was, and couldn't be helped. I had no idea where I was. Owing to a powerful wind, I had been driven out of my course and off my map. Guided by sun and compass, I tried to get the direction of Berlin. Towns, villages, hills and forests were slipping away below me. I did not recognize a thing. I tried in vain to compare the picture beneath my map. Everything was different. I found it impossible to recognize the country. Later on, I discovered the impossibility of finding my way, for I was flying about 60 miles outside my map. After having flown for a couple of hours, my guide and I resolved to land somewhere in the open. That is always unpleasant. One cannot tell how the surface of the ground is in reality. If one of the wheels gets into a hole, one's box is converted into matchwood. We tried to read the name written upon a station, but of course that was impossible. It was too small. So we had to land. We did it with a heavy heart, for nothing else could be done. We looked for a meadow which appeared suitable from above, and tried our luck. Close inspection, unfortunately, showed that the meadow was not as pleasant as it seemed. The fact was obviously proved by the slightly bent frame of our machine. We had made ourselves gloriously ridiculous. We had first lost our way and then smashed the machine. So we had to continue our journey with a commonplace conveyance by railway train. Slowly but surely we reached Berlin. We had landed in the neighborhood of Leipzig. If we had not landed so stupidly, we would certainly have reached Berlin. But sometimes you make a mistake, whatever you do. Some days later I arrived in Schweidnitz, my own town. Although I got there at 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a large crowd at the station. I was very cordially received. In the afternoon various demonstrations took place to honor me, among others, one of the local Boy Scouts. It became clear to me that the people at home took a vivid interest in their fighting soldiers after all. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. My Brother. I had not yet passed 8 days of my leave when I received the telegram, "Lothar is wounded, but not mortally." That was all. Inquiries showed that he had been very rash. He flew against the enemy, together with Allmenröder. Beneath him and a good distance on the other side of the front, he saw in the air a lonely Englishman crawling about. He was one of those hostile infantry flyers who make themselves particularly disagreeable to our troops. We molest them a great deal. Whether they really achieve anything in crawling along the ground is very problematical. My brother was at an altitude of about 6,000 feet, while the Englishman was at about 3,000 feet. He quietly approached the Englishman, prepared to plunge, and in a few seconds was upon him. The Englishman thought he would avoid a duel, and he disappeared likewise by a plunge. My brother, without hesitation, plunged after. He didn't care at all whether he was on one side of the front or the other. He was animated by a single thought: I must down that fellow. That is, of course, the correct way of managing things. Now and then I myself have acted that way. However, if my brother does not have at least one success on every flight, he gets tired of the whole thing. Only a little above the ground, my brother obtained a favorable position towards the English flyer and could shoot into his shop windows. The Englishman fell. There was nothing more to be done. After such a struggle, especially at a low altitude, in the course of which one has so often been twisting and turning, and circling to the right and to the left, the average mortal has no longer the slightest notion of his position. On that day it happened that the air was somewhat misty. The weather was particularly unfavorable. My brother quickly took his bearings and discovered only then that he was a long distance behind the front. He was behind the ridge of Vimy. The top of that hill is about 300 feet higher than the country around. My brother, so the observers on the ground reported, had disappeared behind the Vimy height. It is not a particularly pleasant feeling to fly home over enemy country. One is shot at and cannot shoot back. It is true, however, that a hit is rare. My brother approached the line. At a low altitude one can hear every shot that is fired, and firing sounds then very much like the noise made by chestnuts which are being roasted. Suddenly he felt that he had been hit. That was queer to him. My brother is one of those men who cannot see their own blood. If somebody else was bleeding, it would not impress him very greatly, but the sight of his own blood upsets him. He felt his blood running down his right leg in a warm stream. At the same time, he noticed a pain in his hip. Below, the shooting continued. It followed that he was still over hostile ground. At last the firing gradually ceased. He had crossed the front. Now he must be nimble, for his strength was rapidly ebbing away. He saw a wood, and next to the wood a meadow. Straight for the meadow he flew, and mechanically, almost unconsciously, he switched off the engine. At the same moment he lost consciousness. My brother was in a single-seater. No one could help him. It is a miracle that he came to the ground, for no flying machine lands or starts automatically. There is a rumor that they have at Cologne an old Taube which will start by itself as soon as the pilot takes the seat, which makes the regulation curve and lands again after exactly 5 minutes. Many men pretend to have seen that miraculous machine. I have not seen it, but still I am convinced that the tale is true. Now, my brother was not in such a miraculous automatic machine. Nevertheless, he had not hurt himself in landing. He recovered consciousness only in hospital and was sent to Blois. It is a curious feeling to see one's brother fighting with an Englishman. Once I saw that Lothar, who was lagging behind the squadron, was being attacked by an English aviator. It would have been easy for him to avoid battle. He need only plunge. But he would not do that. That would not even occur to him. He does not know how to run away. Happily, I had observed what was going on and was looking for my chance. I noticed that the Englishman went for my brother and shot at him. My brother tried to reach the Englishman's altitude, disregarding the shots. Suddenly his machine turned a somersault and plunged perpendicularly, turning round and round. It was not an intended plunge, but a regular fall. That is not a nice thing to look at, especially if the falling airman is one's own brother. Gradually I had to accustom myself to that sight, for it was one of my brother's tricks. As soon as he felt sure that the Englishman was his superior, he acted as if he had been shot. The Englishman rushed after him. My brother recovered his balance and in a moment had got above his enemy. The hostile aeroplane could not equally quickly get ready for what was to come. My brother caught it at a favorable angle, and a few seconds after it went down in flames. When a machine is burning, all is lost, for it falls to the ground burning. Once I was on the ground next to a benzine tank. It contained 100 liters of benzine, which exploded and burnt. The heat was so great that I could not bear to be within 10 yards of it. One can therefore imagine what it means if a tank containing a large quantity of this devilish liquid explodes a few inches in front of one while the blast from the propeller blows the flame into one's face. I believe a man must lose consciousness at the very first moment. Sometimes miracles do happen. For instance, I once saw an English aeroplane falling down in flames. The flames burst out only at an altitude of 1,500 feet. The whole machine was burning. When we had flown home, we were told that one of the occupants of the machine had jumped from an altitude of 150 feet. It was the observer. 150 feet is the height of a good-sized steeple. Supposing somebody should jump from its top to the ground, what would be his condition? Most men would break their bones in jumping from a first-floor window. At any rate, this good fellow jumped from a burning machine at an altitude of 150 feet, from a machine which had been burning for over a minute, and nothing happened to him except a simple fracture of the leg. Soon after his adventure he made a statement from which it appears that his nerve had not suffered. Another time I shot down an Englishman. The pilot had been fatally wounded in the head. The machine fell perpendicularly to earth from an altitude of 9,000 feet. Some time later I came gliding down and saw on the ground nothing but a heap of twisted debris. To my surprise, I was told that the observer had only damaged his skull and that his condition was not dangerous. Some people have luck indeed. Once upon a time, Boelcke shot down a Nieuport machine. I was present. The aeroplane fell like a stone. When we had inspected it, we found that it had been driven up to the middle in the loamy soil. The occupant had been shot in the abdomen and had lost consciousness and had wrenched his arm out of its socket on striking the ground. He did not die of his fall. On the other hand, it has happened that a good friend of mine in landing had a slight accident. One of the wheels of his machine got into a rabbit hole. The aeroplane was traveling at no speed and quite slowly went on its head. It seemed to reflect whether it should fall to one side or to the other, turned over, and the poor fellow's back was broken. My brother Lothar is lieutenant in the 4th Dragoons. Before the war he was at the War Academy. He was made an officer at the outbreak and began the war as a cavalryman, exactly as I did. I know nothing about his actions, for he never speaks of himself. However, I have been told the following story. In the winter of 1914, Lothar's regiment was on the Warp. The Russians were on the other side of the river. Nobody knew whether they intended to stay there or to go back. The water was frozen partly along the shore, so it was difficult to ride through the water. There were, of course, no bridges, for the Russians had destroyed them. So my brother swam across, ascertained the position of the Russians, and swam back again. He did that during a severe Russian winter when the thermometer was very low. After a few minutes his clothes were frozen solid. Yet he asserted that he had felt quite warm notwithstanding. He kept on his horse all day long until he got to his quarters in the evening, yet he did not catch a chill. In winter 1915 he followed my urgent advice and went into the flying service. He also became an observer and became a pilot only a year later. Acting as an observer is certainly not a bad training, particularly for a chasing airman. In March 1917 he passed his 3rd examination and came at once to my squadron. When he arrived he was a very young and innocent pilot who never thought of looping and such like tricks. He was quite satisfied if he succeeded in starting his machine and in landing successfully. A fortnight later I took him with me against the enemy for the first time. I asked him to fly close behind me in order that he might see exactly how the fighting was done. After the 3rd flight with him, I suddenly noticed he parted company with me. He rushed at an Englishman and killed him. My heart leapt with joy when I saw it. The event proved once more that there is no art in shooting down an aeroplane. The thing is done by the personality or by the fighting determination of the airman. I am not a pigou, and I do not wish to be a pigou. I am only a soldier who does his duty. 4 weeks later my brother had shot down a total of 20 Englishmen. His record as a flyer is probably unique. It has probably not happened in any other case that a pilot, a fortnight after his 3rd examination, has shot down his first enemy, and that he has shot down 20 during the first 4 weeks of his fighting life. My brother's 22nd opponent was the celebrated Captain Ball. He was by far the best English flyer. Major Hawker, who in his time was as renowned as Captain Ball, I had pressed to my bosom some months previously. It was a particular pleasure to me that it fell to my brother to settle England's 2nd flying champion. Captain Ball flew a triplane and encountered my brother flying by himself at the front. Each tried to catch the other. Neither gave his opponent a chance. Every encounter was a short one. They were constantly dashing at one another. Neither succeeded in getting behind the other. Suddenly both resolved to fire a few well-aimed shots during the few moments of the encounter. Both rushed at one another and fired. Both had before them their engine. The probability of a hit was very small, for their speed was twice as great as normally. It was improbable that either should succeed. My brother, who was a little lower, had pulled his machine around too hard, and the result was that it overturned. For a moment his aeroplane became unsteerable. But presently he recovered control and found out that his opponent had smashed both his benzine tanks. Therefore he had to stop the engine and land it quickly. Otherwise his machine might burst into flames. His next idea was, what has become of my opponent? At the moment when his machine turned in somersault, he had seen that the enemy's machine was rearing up in the air and had also turned a somersault. He therefore could not be very far. His whole thought was, is he above me or beneath me? He was not above, but he saw the triplane falling down in a series of somersaults. It fell until it came to the ground, where it was smashed to pieces. This happened on German territory. Both opponents had hit one another with their machine guns. My brother's machine had had both benzine tanks smashed, and at the same moment Captain Ball had been shot through the head. He carried with him some photographs and cuttings from the newspapers of his town, where he had been greatly feted. In Boelcke's time, Captain Ball destroyed 36 German machines. He, too, had found his master. Was it by chance that a prominent man such as he also should die an ordinary soldier's death? Captain Ball was certainly the commander of the anti-Richthofen squadron. I believe that the Englishmen will now give up their attempt to catch me. I should regret it, for in that case I should miss many opportunities to make myself beloved by them. Had my brother not been wounded on the 5th of May, he would probably, on my return from furlough, also have been given a leave of absence, with 52 hostile machines to his credit. My father discriminates between a sportsman and a butcher. The former shoots for fun. When I have shot down an Englishman, my hunting passion is satisfied for a quarter of an hour. Therefore, I do not succeed in shooting 2 Englishmen in succession. If one of them comes down, I have the feeling of complete satisfaction. Only much later I have overcome my instinct and have become a butcher. My brother is differently constituted. I had an opportunity of observing him when he was shooting down his 4th and 5th opponents. We were attacking in a squadron. I started the dance. I had settled my opponent very quickly. When I looked around, I noticed my brother rushing after an English machine which was bursting into flames and exploded. Next to it was another Englishman. My brother, though following number 1, immediately directed his machine gun against number 2, although his first opponent was still in the air and had not yet fallen. His second victim also fell after a short struggle. When we met at home he asked me proudly, "How many have you shot down?" I said quite modestly, "1." He turned his back upon me and said, "I did too." Thereupon I sent him forward to make inquiries. He was to find out the names of his victims, etc. He returned late in the afternoon, having been able to find only a single Englishman. He had looked carelessly, as is usual amongst such butchers. Only on the following day I received a report as to the place where the second had come down. We all had seen his fall. I shoot a bison. When visiting headquarters, I met the Prince von Pless. He permitted me to shoot a bison on his estate. The bison has died out. On the whole earth there are only 2 spots where bisons may be found. These are the Pless estate and in the Białowież estate of the ex-Czar. The Białowież forest has, of course, suffered terribly through the war. Many a magnificent bison which ought to have been shot either by the Czar or by some other monarch has been eaten by German musketeers. Through the kindness of the Prince, I was permitted to shoot so rare an animal. In a few decades none will be left. I arrived at Pless on the afternoon of the 26th of May and had to start immediately from the station if I wished to kill a bull the same evening. We drove along a celebrated road through the giant preserves of the Prince, which has been frequented by many crowned heads. After about an hour we got out and had to walk half an hour to come to the shooting place. The drivers had already been placed in position. The signal was given to them and they began to drive. I stood at an elevated spot which had been occupied, according to the head forester, by His Majesty, who from thence had shot many a bison. We waited some considerable time. Suddenly I saw among the timber a giant black monster rolling along. It came straight in my direction. I noticed it before the head forester had. I got ready for firing and must say that I felt somewhat feverish. It was a mighty bull. When he was at a distance of 200 yards there was still some hope for him. I thought it was too far for a shot. Of course I could have hit the monster because it was impossible to miss such a huge beast. However, it would have been unpleasant to search for him. Besides, it would have been ridiculous had I missed him, so I thought I would wait until he came nearer. Probably he noticed the drivers, for he suddenly turned and came rushing towards me at a sharp angle and at a speed which seemed to me incredible. It was a bad position for a shot, and in a moment he disappeared behind a group of stout trees. I heard him snorting and stamping. I lost sight of him. I have no idea whether he smelt me or not. At any rate, he had disappeared. I caught another glimpse of him at a long distance, and he was gone. I do not know whether it was the unaccustomed aspect of the animal or whether something else affected me. At any rate, at the moment when the bull came near, I had the same feeling, the same feverishness which seizes me when I am sitting in my aeroplane and notice an Englishman at so great a distance that I have to fly perhaps 5 minutes in order to get near him. The only difference is that the Englishman defends himself. Possibly different feelings would have moved me had I been standing on level ground and not on an elevated position. Before long, a second bison came near. He was also a huge fellow. He made it easier for me to fire my shot. At a distance of 80 yards, I fired at him, but I had missed my opportunity to shoot him in the shoulder. A month before, Hindenburg had told me, when talking of bison, "You must take a lot of cartridges with you. I have spent on such a fellow half a dozen, for he does not die easily. His heart lies so deep that one misses it as a rule." That was really so. Although I knew exactly where the bison's heart was, I had missed it. I fired a second shot and a third. Hit for the third time, the bull stopped perhaps 50 yards from me. 5 minutes later, the beast was dead. The shooting was finished. All 3 bullets had hit him close above the heart. We drove now past the beautiful hunting box of the Prince through the forest in which the guests of Prince Pless shoot every year deer and other animals. Then we looked at the interior of the house in Promnitz. It is situated on a peninsula. It commands beautiful views, and for 3 miles around there is no human being. One has no longer the feeling that one is in a preserve of the ordinary kind when one visits the estate of Prince Pless, for the preserve extends to 1,000,000 acres. It contains glorious stags which have never been seen by man. No forester knows them. Occasionally they are shot. One can tramp about for weeks without seeing a bison. During certain times of the year it is impossible to find one. They like quietude, and they can hide themselves in the gigantic forests and tangled woods. We saw many beautiful deer. After about 2 hours we arrived at Pless, just before it became dark. Infantry flyers, artillery flyers, and reconnoitering machines. Had I not become a professional chaser, I should have turned an infantry flyer. After all, it must be a very satisfactory feeling to be able to aid those troops whose work is hardest. The infantry flyer can do a great deal to assist a man on foot. For that reason, his is a very grateful task. In the course of the Battle of Arras, I observed many of these splendid fellows. They flew in any weather and at any time at low altitude over the enemy, and tried to act as connecting links with our hard-pressed troops. I can understand that one can fight with enthusiasm when one is given such a task. I dare say many an airman has shouted hurrah when, after an assault, he saw the hostile masses stream back, or when our smart infantry leaped from the trenches and fought the aggressors eye to eye. Many a time after a chasing expedition I have fired my remaining cartridges into the enemy trenches. Although I may have done little practical good, such firing affects the enemy's morale. I have also been an artillery flyer. In my time it was a novelty to regulate the firing of one's own artillery by wireless telegraphy. To do this well, an airman requires special talent. I could not do the work for long. I prefer fighting. Very likely, artillery officers make the best artillery flyers. At least they have the necessary knowledge of the arm which they serve. I have done a lot of reconnoitering by airplane, particularly in Russia during the War of Movement. Then I acted once more as a cavalryman. The only difference was that I rode a Pegasus made of steel. My days spent with friend Holck among the Russians were among the finest in my life. In the Western theatre, the eye of the reconnaissance flyer sees things which are very different from those to which the cavalryman gets accustomed. Villages and towns, railways and roads seem lifeless and dead. Yet there is a colossal traffic going on all the time, but it is hidden from the flying men with great skill. Only a wonderfully trained, practiced and observant eye can see anything definite when one is traveling at a great height and at a terrific speed. I have excellent eyes, but it seems doubtful to me whether there is anyone who can see anything definite when he looks down upon a road from an altitude of 15,000 feet. As the eye is an imperfect object for observation, one replaces it by the photographic apparatus. Everything that seems important to one must be photographed. Besides, one must photograph those things which one is told to photograph. If one comes home and if the plates have gone wrong, the whole flight has been for nothing. It often happens to flying men who do reconnoitering that they get involved in a fight. However, their task is more important than fighting. Frequently, a photographic plate is more valuable than the shooting down of a squadron. Hence, the flying photographer should, as a rule, not take a hand in fighting. Nowadays, it is a difficult task to reconnoiter efficiently in the West. The German flying machines. In the course of the war, the German flying machines have experienced great changes. That is probably generally known. There is a colossal difference between a giant plane and a chaser plane. The chaser plane is small, fast, quick at turning. It carries nothing apart from the pilot except machine guns and cartridges. The giant plane is a colossus. Its only duty is to carry as much weight as possible, and it is able to do this owing to the large surface of its planes. It is worthwhile to look at the gigantic English plane which landed smoothly on the German side of the front. The giant plane can carry an unbelievable weight. It will easily fly away, dragging from 3 to 5 tons. Its benzine tanks look as large as railroad cars. In going about in such a colossus, one has no longer the sensation that one is flying. One is driving. In going about in a giant plane, the direction depends no longer on one's instinct, but on the technical instruments which one carries. A giant plane has a huge number of horsepowers. I do not know exactly how many, but they are many thousand. The greater the horsepower is, the better. It seems not impossible that the day may come when a whole division will be transported in such a thing. In its body, one can go for a walk. In one of its quarters there is an indescribable something. It contains an apparatus for wireless telephony by means of which one can converse with the people down below. In another corner are hanging the most attractive liver sausages which one can imagine. They are the famous bombs which cause such a fright to the good people down below. At every corner is a gun. The whole thing is a flying fortress, and these planes with their stays and supports look like arcades. I have never been able to feel enthusiasm for these giant barges. I find them horrible, unsportslike, boring and clumsy. I rather like a machine of the type of Le Petit Rouget. If one is in a small chaser plane, it is quite immaterial whether one flies on one's back, whether one flies up or down, stands on one's heads, etc. One can play any tricks one likes, for in such a machine one can fly like a bird. The only difference is that one does not fly with wings as does the bird albatross. The thing is, after all, merely a flying engine. I think things will come to this, that we shall be able to buy a flying suit for half a crown. One gets into it. On the other end there is a little engine and a little propeller. You stick your arms into planes and your legs into the tail. Then you will do a few leaps in order to start, and away you will go, up into the air like a bird. My dear reader, I hear you laughing at my story. But we do not know yet whether our children will laugh at it. Everyone would have laughed 50 years ago if somebody had spoken about flying above Berlin. I remember the sensation which was caused when, in 1910, Zeppelin came for the first time to Berlin. Now, no Berlin street man looks up into the air when an airship is coming along. Besides giant planes and little chaser planes, there are innumerable other types of flying machines, and they are of all sizes. Inventiveness has not yet come to an end. Who can tell what machine we shall employ a year hence in order to perforate the atmosphere? This is the end of The Red Battle Flyer by Manfred von Richthofen. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.